Our next speaker is going to address a topic. So, if you want to get people to do things in the right way, you have to engineer carrots and sticks, rewards and punishment, right? Or maybe not. So our next speaker is going to tell us how he's going to turn that conventional wisdom upside down with 50 years of behavioral science research. He's an internationally best-selling author and a journalist and a speechwriter, Dan Pink.
All right. All right, thank you, David. All right, I'm feeling a little inadequate here. We got one person who's freaking making organs in his lab. Someone else who's climbing Mount Everest, and I get introduced. This guy used to write speeches. Woohoo! Way to go. Feel really good about all this now. Thank you, folks. So I'm actually fortunately, I come here with very modest ambitions. What I want to do here today is not lay out a broad theory of the universe or anything grandiose like that, or a paradigm shift or anything like that. I just want to tell you one story and make one point. I want to tell you one story and leave you with one point. And I'm actually going to take Allison's advice in that I hope that by the end of this, I get out alive, I have all my fingers, and I'm still friends with all of you. So I'm going to tell a story about these guys right here. Where are they? These guys. These guys. Andrei Geim and Konstantin Novoselov. Now, how many people know who Andrei Geim and Konstantin Novoselov are? Let's see a show of hands. It looks like less than half of you know who they are. Let me explain who they are. These guys won the 2010 Nobel Prize in Physics. The 2010 Nobel Prize in Physics. Their great breakthrough, their great discovery, they isolated something called graphene. Graphene is a substance that is 1 atom thick. 1 atom thick, and something like 70 or 80 times the strength of steel. Whoa. I mean, it sounds like, I think I read something about that in Harry Potter, right? It sounds fantastical, but it's one of the biggest breakthroughs in material science in 50 years, and it's an extraordinary achievement. Just to give you a taste of this, here's how some of their fellow physicists described it. They said, if scaled up to the thickness of a plastic refrigerator wrap, a sheet of graphene stretched over a coffee cup would support the weight of a truck bearing down on a pencil point. Okay, serious. All right, a huge breakthrough. So I want to tell a story about how did this happen, okay? There are a lot of smart people out there. These are smart guys. There are a lot of smart people out there. There are a lot of smart people in the audience. But how do you do a breakthrough like this? I want to talk about that and tell the story of that. But first, I want to ask you a question. The question is this. How many of you, see another show of hands, how many of you have an iPad? Whoa, lots of you. Okay, of you who have an iPad, how many of you knew 18 months ago you were missing an iPad? That's actually a very serious question, because today, especially those of you who are in business, the most important cognitive skill is the ability to iterate something new, to give the world something it didn't know it was missing. All right? It used to be, in the old days of business, that you would have a category, and you could actually make a living, do okay, inside that category, enhancing that category. I think that those days are ending, or those days are certainly far less lucrative. Today, the real juice, the real action belongs in category creation. Create a category, don't enhance a category. Come up with something entirely novel. Come up with something the world didn't know it was missing. And so the question, as David was saying, is, so how do we motivate people to do that? How do we create the conditions in which people are able to do that kind of breakthrough work? Well, there's an answer in some of the research, and the answer comes from people who every day at least try to give the world something it didn't know it was missing. Artists. That's what artists do, right? That's what dancers do, that's what poets do, that's what painters do, that's what sculptors do. So let's talk about what motivates artists. There's some very interesting research on this. I'll give you one little taste of it. Some research done by a fascinating scholar named Teresa Amabile at Harvard University. And she did a study of artists. She got 23 artists, painters and sculptors, and she had them randomly select 10 of their commissioned works and 10 of their non-commissioned works. You with me? 10 of their, it's actually not that complicated. 10 of their commissioned works and 10 of their non-commissioned works. So we got 20 works of art times 23 artists. That's 460 works of art. Got it? They bring these 460 works, their works on paper, paintings, sculptures. They bring them into a room kind of like this, and they bring in a panel of art experts. Now, these art experts, they're museum curators, gallery owners, art historians, other artists. They don't know where these works of art came from. And the task for these art experts is evaluate these works of art. Evaluate these works of art. Here's what they wrote in the paper. Here's what the scholars wrote in the paper. Our results were quite startling. Now, I know we have a few social scientists here today, and some of you who read social science, but for those of you who aren't as hip to that, just want to point out that this is about as exuberant as these guys get. The commission works, she wrote, were rated as significantly less creative than the non-commission works, yet they were not rated as different in technical quality. In other words, that's interesting, and some of you are nodding as if this made perfect sense. They were surprised by this. Indeed, they found it startling, right? The idea is that, hey, wait a second, if I pay you $1,000 for a painting, you should be motivated to do a really good painting. And that's true. What they found, though, was that to translate this just a little bit, the commission works and the non-commission works were rated similarly on technical quality. Remember, these are people who are making a living in the fine arts. You know anybody who makes a living as a sculptor? To make a living as a sculptor, you got to be a freaking good sculptor, all right? So the technical quality was the same, but over and over again, it was the non-commissioned works that were deemed more creative. And as they explored this and they interviewed the artists talked about constraints. Constraints. A few constraints were fine, but once you get past a certain, very limited point, they said, I want a painting, I want it to be this size, I need it by this date, it can't clash with my green sofa. Once you get past a certain small point, they say, hey, it's no longer mine. So I'll do something technically good and compliant, but I'm not going to do anything great. The work came from, the great work, the breakthrough work, was in the non-commissioned side of the artwork. Why am I mentioning this? Well, because here's the thing. We want breakthroughs. We want this kind of cognitive skill. We want people to give the world something it didn't know it was missing. And yet, if we look at our organizations, profit, government, nonprofit, private sector, even our schools, when we look at our organizations in North America, there's no non-commissioned work. Everything we do at work is commissioned work. And yet we have this body of evidence that says if you want the breakthroughs, it's non-commissioned work. Now the cool thing is that you see the first stirrings, though, of some change. Let me give you some examples here. Let's take this company right here, Atlassian. Atlassian is an Australian software company, and they do something really cool. Once a quarter, on Thursday afternoons, they say to their software developers, go work on anything you want, whatever you feel like. Do it the way you want, do it with whomever you want, do whatever you want. The only thing we ask is that you show what you've created to the rest of the company on Friday afternoon in this fun, freewheeling meeting. They call these things FedEx days because you have to deliver something overnight. It turns out that this one day of intense, undiluted autonomy has led to a whole array of fixes for existing software, ideas for new products, improvements to internal processes that had otherwise never emerged. Now, this is a very different approach to motivation. It's not dangling a carrot out in front of somebody and saying, if you do something groovy, I'll give you this crunchy carrot. It's saying, we hire good people want to do good things. Maybe one way to help good people do good things is to get out of their way for a day. And this is an idea that is spreading. These FedEx days are growing like kudzu. I figure people in Houston know what kudzu is, right? It's growing like kudzu. Actually, Anthony is growing kudzu in that same lab. No, it's growing like kudzu all over this country. Huge numbers of organizations are doing this. Last month, Frito-Lay did a FedEx Day internally. Cisco is doing FedEx Days. Schools are doing FedEx Days. And this is just one example of it. Let me give you and it's not happening only from the marquee places. Let me talk about the powerful and legendary Columbia Credit Union in Washington State. There's a woman there named Jen Schaffner. She runs the customer service department. It's the customer service department at this small credit union in kind of a rural part of Washington State. The customer service department consists of 6 people. They're mostly answering the phones from credit union members. Jen Schaffner is a wonderful young woman. She's probably 25 years old. She said, you know what, I want people to be more creative. I want them to do kind of breakthrough things. What can I do? And she came up with this idea, the Genius Hour. So for her staff, 1 hour a week, they go off and do whatever they want. Come up with a better way to run the place. Come up with a new product offering. And you know what kind of boss she is? During the hour they're on their Genius Hour, She covers the phones on their behalf, right? That's what we're talking about. Give you another example. Let's take this company here, Intuit. Very powerful, really cool, interesting company. They make software like TurboTax and Quicken and QuickBooks, software that many of you have used. They face, like all technology companies, like all companies in general, this constant churn of challenges. For instance, they used to sell their software on platters, in shrink wrap boxes. Remember, you used to buy software in shrink wrap boxes, right? You remember that? Okay, you should. It was like 3 years ago. But seriously, when was the last time you bought software like that? You want it downloadable. So they made this massive change to make their software downloadable. Give each other high fives. Uh-oh. Now everything works, but then they start hearing from their customers. I want Quicken on my BlackBerry. I want TurboTax on my iPad. Ugh. Now we got to make it accessible to mobile devices. Intuit has something called 10% time, where people can spend 10% of their time working on whatever they want. Now, this sounds all kind of loosey-goosey, summer of love, Woodstock, follow your... Get over that. This is very hard-headed and very strategic. The companies that do this don't sign away the intellectual property rights to what's created during that 10% time, which is smart. Here's what the head of innovation at Intuit told me not too long ago. After our CEO declared mobile was key to our strategy, none of our business units were able to change direction on a dime. But our employees using 10% time created 7 mobile apps before any formally funded mobile projects even got started. Now, Google, being Google, has 20% time. 20% of your time working on whatever you want. All right, this is more familiar. Now, Google's not signing away the IP rights to what's created on that time, which is smart. Google News, which has reshaped the American newspaper business. Not an official project, a 20% project. Anybody have a Gmail account? Gmail, not an official project, a 20% project. Here's what one Google engineer says. Just about all the good ideas here have bubbled up from 20% time. Which sort of makes you wonder what they're doing the other 80%. But that's the point. No, that's the point. Here's how you think of it. 80% commission work, 20% non-commission work. Intuit, 90% commission work, 10% non-commission work. Columbia Credit Union, 39 hours a week of commission work, 1 hour a week of non-commission work. FedEx Days, 361 days a year of commission work, 4 days of non-commission work. See a pattern, folks? And that leads us back to the heroes, Andrei Geim and Konstantin Novoselov. They have a laboratory at the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom. They have all kinds of work. They write grants to get funding for research. They have papers due. But at this laboratory, since its inception, they have always carved out time for what they call Friday evening experiments. At this laboratory, they take a few hours every week, usually on Friday nights because they're physicists, to work on stuff that they're interested in, stuff they're curious about. A couple of hours a week of just stuff they're curious about. Here are the rules. It can't be anything where you have a paper due. It can't be anything you have funding for. And the third rule, which Novoselov says, you're allowed to do whatever you want as long as it's not boring. They made their breakthrough on graphene, not in their official work, but in their Friday evening experiments. Think about that, class. They made one of the biggest breakthroughs in material science in a half century. They won the Nobel Prize, not for their commission work, but for their non-commission work. Nobel Prize is pretty good, right? I mean, you get this groovy medal, you get to meet the Queen of Sweden. I mean, I've got 3 kids. If one of my kids called me up in 5 years, 10, 20 years and said, hey, Dad, I just won the Nobel Prize in physics, I would say, oh, that's not bad. They won the Nobel Prize in physics. So what I want for their non-commissioned work. So here's what I want to implore you to do. This is my challenge to you, my call to action to you. Whether you're running an organization, large or small, carve out some time for non-commissioned work. Carve out some time for non-commissioned work. This is where the world is going. These things that often seem hippy-dippy at one moment in time, end up being mainstream. This is where the world is going. If you want those breakthroughs, you need to rethink the architecture of the places where people do work and carve out some time for non-commissioned work. Carve out some time for non-commissioned work. That's my call to action. I want you to think about how you can do this. A Genius Hour, a FedEx Day, something like that, and get started. But I want to warn you about something. There's a barrier to this. There's a big barrier to this, and it's a barrier that gets even more severe the larger the organization you work in. And that's also part of our story. Andre Geim also won something called the Ig Nobel Prize. Anybody ever heard of that? This is a prize for scientific research that is ridiculous, absurd, laughable, insane. What were they thinking? The Ig Nobel Prizes for 2001 were awarded 4 weeks ago, and I'll give you a taste of what it was like. The Ig Nobel Prize in Peace the Ig Nobel Peace Prize went to the mayor of Vilnius for discovering, and this is a direct quote, that the problem of illegally parked luxury cars can be solved by running over them with an armed tank. The Ig Nobel Prize in Medicine went to a paper titled Inhibitory Spillover, Increased Urination Urgency Facilitates Impulse Control in Unrelated Domains. Part of which says that if you have to pee really badly, it has a deleterious effect on your short-term memory. But where was I? No, Andre Geim won the Ig Nobel Prize 10 years ago for an interesting piece of research. He had a theory. The theory was that all matter is made up of atoms. Atoms each have a nucleus. Inside of that nucleus are electrons. Okay? Electrons don't really like magnetic fields very much. They repel them. So he figured since living beings are made up of atoms, and since their atoms have nuclei, and so those nuclei have electrons, if we put a living being in a powerful enough magnetic field, it will the force of those electrons in the opposite direction will overcome the force of gravity and allow that living being to float in the air magically. So he decided to do this with a frog. And here's the video. It worked! Andre Geim levitated a frog. Woo! Now this is absurd. What? It's crazy. It doesn't have much usefulness. Although, I mean, some of you, I think, thought that was going to be a Will It Blend video. Just Google it. But that's the point, is that here's what's going to happen if you carve out time for non-commissioned work. Here's what's going to happen. Novoselov says it really well. 90% of those Friday evening experiments don't work. A lot of this stuff is not going to work. And you know what? That's okay. You're going to get criticized for that, but that's okay. Some of this stuff isn't going to work, but that's why the other stuff does work. So you got to deal with that. You got to deal with the naysayers. You got to deal with the people who think that what you're doing is insane. That's the course. Let me just go back here. So that leads us to the moral of this story. The moral of this story, right? I implore you to carve out some time for non-commissioned work, but I warn you that you're going to have some problems, and this is okay. Here's what Andre Geim says. Human progress has always been driven by a sense of adventure and unconventional thinking. True that, right? But that's the moral of this story. I left out the big part. He made, the frog was a Friday evening experiment. Should have mentioned that earlier. The frog was a Friday evening experiment, all right? He got an Ig Nobel Prize and a Nobel Prize for these Friday evening experiments. And that's the point. You're going to get bad stuff, but you're going to get some amazing stuff, and you can't separate them, because human progress has always been driven by a sense of adventure and unconventional thinking. And that leads us to the moral of the story. The moral of the story. Now, many of us know morals of the story from Aesop, but I think today, 2011, a moral of any story has to be short, sweet, and easy to retweet. So here's the moral of the story of Andre Geim and Konstantin Novoselov. The moral of the story, maybe even the message of this conference, at some level, the meaning of life itself. The moral of the story is this. If you really want to change the world, you have to levitate some frogs. Thank you. Stay out here.
Dan Pink. Quick question for you. So a lot of bosses are aware of Google's 20% time. Why don't more bosses do this? What stops them from doing this?
I think a few things stop them. Number one, if they're a publicly held company, most publicly held companies are incredibly short-term thinkers. They care about the next quarter. So I talk to managers around the country, and they say, hey, this stuff is really groovy. I'll try it next quarter. I got to meet my numbers. That's one thing. This very different approach to motivating people. The old approach to motivating people of carrots and sticks, it's really easy. Really easy. Hey, $5,000 for whoever comes up with a good idea. People will respond, they scurry around, the manager goes back to her office, pats herself on the back for being a charismatic leader. This other stuff is really, really hard. So it's very stubborn and persistent why these things remain.
And what's the optimal percentage of time?
It's an interesting question. I don't know if there is one. As companies and organizations begin experimenting with this, the numbers are coming in lower than 20%. Atlassian actually tried 20% time because the FedEx days were so successful. And they meticulously charted it. And they found their folks coming in at 7%, 8%, 9%, largely because people felt they had obligations to their teammates that they didn't want to betray. And so I think it seems to be hovering, 10 plus or minus 2.
Okay, thanks
right.
so much, Dan Pink.